Chapter 4. The Mobility of Individuality. The conditions you foster for others in this life could be your own in another. Today, the world generally unites in a communal pride in the seminal achievement of Neil Armstrong as the first among humankind to set foot on a cosmological body other than the Earth. In this achievement, we acknowledge the triumph of the human spirit and intellect to measure, understand, manipulate, and control the laws of nature, to implement a mobility of the living form through space-time, unlike any that had previously been achieved. Humankind, as a species, like many other hosts for life in Earth's ecosystem, has evolved a basic mobility of individuality, implemented via our host forms, functions, and structures. This local mobility is evolved for movement through direct contact with the environment. Legs, wings, fins, flagella are some of the means by which the physical mobility of the living individual is achieved by species on Earth. Additionally, humankind has realized great utility in further extending this basic capability with technology. Thus, the mobility of individuality on human scales has been enhanced by wheels, airframes, engines, and rockets. Our thoughts often do not extend or associate this mobility of our physical form with either the local or universal mobility of our position of view. That is the mobility of our individuality. We have a very limited scope of extrapolating many of the implementations around us, natural or otherwise, even those that we conceive and develop ourselves, to a context greater than our immediate utility and practical concerns. However, with the accomplishments of NASA's Apollo missions, humankind has extended its reach beyond our usual scope. In so doing, we have opened a new realm of mobility of individuality that must be addressed and understood, not only in technological terms, but also for what the movement and relocation of Neil's position of view, or POV, to the Moon's surface say to us as individuals about our living circumstances in this universe. We take as a foregone conclusion that life can exist anywhere in this universe so long as the resources needed to sustain it are present. This is a very complacent assumption, despite the likelihood that it may very well be so. It is not too surprising that we make this assumption. After all, there are no examples to the contrary in any Earth or near-Earth environment. In fact, one of the underlying tenets of our present-day scientific method, as implied by current measurements of the fine structure constant, states that the laws of physics are upheld everywhere in this universe. This consistency offers a reasonably good basis for our certainty. Nonetheless, life can be quite complicated and has many requirements and influences that are well understood, yet perhaps there are other factors critical to life yet to be discovered. We know that most Earth life depends on proper sustenance, or energy, water, oxygen, temperature, and pressure levels to be maintained at least in the near term. We also have a long-term need for gravity, or an equivalent force. Nevertheless, life, as we know it, may yet have some undiscovered intrinsic dependency on properties in or near the area around Earth or around the Sun. Mission planners acknowledged this possibility when they sent the first-ever Earth life into space on board a captured V-2 rocket on February 20th, 1947. These original astronauts were a group of fruit flies, insects being as good a representation of Earth life as any other. This first volley into the unknown environment outside the Earth's atmosphere was extremely dangerous, not just in terms of the technological or known dangers inherent to extraterrestrial space due to its lack of the known required resources mentioned earlier, but primarily because space could have proven to be fundamentally incompatible with a living entity's instantiation, its being. So how do we know for near certain that individual life can exist anywhere in this universe? Interestingly, the best evidence to date for the universal mobility of individuality presented itself when Neil Armstrong pressed his boot into the soft silt of the Moon's surface. Neil Armstrong, surviving his giant leap for mankind, suggests that life as we know it is not utterly dependent upon any resource intrinsic or unique to the Earth, or the very local space-time around it. For example, we could have evolved with a dependence on Earth's unique magnetic field configuration, or on Earth's specific gravitational field intensity, or some other completely unknown and unrecognized property of either Earth itself or the space near to the Earth. If this was indeed the case, the crew of Apollo 11 and the fruit flies before them could have tragically deinstantiated, ceased to live, once they passed some threshold or boundary somewhere between the Earth's surface and the Moon's surface. Perhaps once the spacecraft passed some critical flux level in Earth's magnetic field, or once the Earth's gravitational field dropped below some essential level. Each of the unsuspecting astronauts, human or fruit fly, could have simply extinguished. Immediately or gradually, like light bulbs whose electric current had been turned off. Perhaps their molecular bonds could have just dissipated due to some unknown property of space. There may yet remain some irreproducible property of our Sun unknown to us that is critical to sustaining Earth life. After all, Earth life has never been tested beyond the Sun's heliospheres. Presumably, each of these needs could ultimately be overcome and provided for by technology. Nonetheless, the amazingly profound statement suggested by Neil Armstrong surviving his first step on the Moon isn't only that we can overcome the technological hurdles of space travel, but rather that nature in this universe permits individuality to exist elsewhere, and likely everywhere. That not only the physical form, but the individual's first-person position of view, or POV, that is, one's being, one's natural entanglement, one's instantiation, is indeed mobile in this universe, and perhaps throughout nature. Neil Armstrong's giant step for mankind suggests that the individual POV can exist not just where it was instantiated, where it entangled its host form, but quite likely anywhere in this universe due to the unrestricted, instantaneous universal ubiquity of natural entanglement. On the other hand, the irreversibility of extinction and evolution, together with relativistic constraints, mandate that the individual cannot be instantiated or rendered universally mobile by the physical forms made of local collections of atoms in this universe, because unlike NASA, nature does not use spacecraft for the universal mobility of the individual. Comprehending the reality of one's living circumstances begins with the realization that Neil Armstrong's first step on the surface of the Moon, or perhaps Yuri Gagarin's first orbit around the Earth, or that the intrepid voyage of those first insects demonstrated that the mobility of individuality exists in this universe. Mobility not defined by locomotion or travel of your current host form, but by a fundamental property of nature with degrees of freedom much greater than that of matter. Realize that the instantiation of any individual, one's position of view, may be hosted anywhere in space-time by any viable environment which happens to emerge naturally or artificially on any planet orbiting any star. These convenient environments also include the living hosts we refer to as species. The obstacles presented by travel involve the movement of the matter-based components of the instantiated individual through expanses of space-time, small or large. Nature, in its implementation of life, circumvents this issue by implementing only the mobility of the POV, the component of the individual, which is temporarily instantiated by natural entanglement to a locally available form. Ergo, in nature, the physical host, the species, is always left behind. The line hypothesis is a plausible hypothesis for the axiom. Individuality exists, and it is naturally mobile in this universe. Given the current state of scientific understanding, the only exhibitive evidence for individuality that can be offered to you is you. So it falls upon each of us to decide if oneself is an individual or not. Further, each instance of life to any other instance of life is only an extrapolation or an assumption of individuality currently based upon appearance and behavior. The affirmation of one's own individuality, at least for most reasonable-minded individuals, can be accounted for. If we agree to the axiom that you and perhaps I, as well as every other discernibly living entity, is an individual instance of life, then this conversation, as challenging as it may be towards strongly held beliefs or ideologies, may proceed. No aspect of the modern scientific understanding of biology or its empirical descriptions is being challenged. The cell and the verifiable aspects of its biological evolution are as science currently describes them. The line hypothesis begins where the modern scientific narrative admittedly voluntarily abstains, and traditionally religions are permitted to fill what is arguably the most important of all voids, and likely the only void any living being may actually care most about. That is, the natural mechanisms governing the instantiation of life. It is for this reason that humankind has fought and prayed for a time far longer than science itself has existed. It is much overdue for the narrative to be extended, not by mysticism or ideological entrenchment, but by well-reasoned, steely objective thought, because clearly not just some, but all of nature is ultimately science.